The Syrian War, which began in 2011, is one of the most complex and devastating conflicts in modern history, with long-term consequences for the Middle East and the international order. Started in the context of the Arab Spring, a series of peaceful protests against the authoritarian regime of Bashar al-Assad quickly evolved into a prolonged and bloody civil war involving various internal and external actors. This conflict not only caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, but also displaced millions, triggering an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. It also had far-reaching repercussions on regional and international geopolitics, becoming a veritable proxy battleground where major powers and regional players vied for influence. Considered one of the most profound tragedies of the 21st century, the Syrian war continues to leave lasting marks on politics, society, and the world economy. After its independence in 1946, Syria experienced decades of political instability, marked by military coups and authoritarian regimes. In 1971, Hafez al-Assad, an army officer, came to power and established a strongly centralized and repressive regime, based on the Ba'ath Party and backed by a powerful security apparatus. During his 30 years in power, Hafez consolidated a militaristic regime, silencing any form of opposition and severely restricting political and social freedoms in the country. His rule was characterized by the repression of dissent and the maintenance of an authoritarian political system in which the opposition was constantly stifled. With the death of Hafez al-Assad in 2000, power was transferred to his son, Bashar al-Assad. Initially, there were hopes of political reforms and greater openness, but these expectations quickly dissipated. Bashar's regime followed an authoritarian line, with traces of his father's rule. Corruption remained endemic, unemployment rose and social inequalities worsened, fueling growing popular discontent. Repression of the opposition remained a constant, which intensified internal tension and a lack of trust in the government. This scenario was one of the main factors that contributed to the emergence of protests and uprisings in 2011. The conflict began in the context of the Arab Spring, a movement of popular protests that spread across the Arab world in 2010 and 2011. In March 2011, the arrest and torture of a group of teenagers who had written anti-regime slogans on a school wall in the southern Syrian city of Dara sparked a series of peaceful demonstrations. Inspired by protests in countries such as Tunisia and Egypt, Syrians took to the streets demanding greater freedom, an end to corruption and democratic reforms. However, the response of the Bashar al-Assad regime was brutal. The security forces cracked down on peaceful demonstrators with tear gas, shootings, and mass arrests, further aggravating the popular uprising. As the repression worsened, the protests quickly spread to several cities across the country, gaining strength and size. Instead of responding to the demands for reforms, the regime began to treat the demonstrators as enemies of the state, which radicalized the opposition. Initially, many Syrians only demanded political change, but with the increasing brutality of the repression, they began to demand the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. This climate of repression and violence generated growing resentment against the government and, within a few weeks, what began as a peaceful protest movement turned into armed resistance. The relentless repression and the regime's refusal to engage in dialogue with the opposition plunged the country into civil war, with multiple factions fighting against the government forces. This conflict, initially limited to a series of protests, quickly turned into a devastating war that destabilized the whole of Syria and profoundly affected the region. Faced with the brutality of the regime, armed opposition groups began to emerge. Several soldiers deserted the Syrian army and formed the Free Syrian Army, FSA, a coalition of dissident soldiers who joined the armed opposition. As clashes escalated in various parts of the country, the conflict quickly turned into a multi-front civil war, with factions loyal to the regime and opposition groups fighting for control of various regions. Major cities such as Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus became intense battlefields, where violence and attacks destroyed infrastructure and increased the suffering of the civilian population. The situation has become even more complex with the emergence of jihadist groups such as the al-Nusra Front, with links to al-Qaeda. This group took advantage of the power vacuum created by the civil war to expand its presence in Syria. Subsequently, the Islamic State, ISIS, an even more radical faction, proclaimed the creation of a caliphate in 2014 and quickly conquered vast portions of Syrian territory, including parts of the north and east of the country. ISIS has implemented brutal governance, with public executions and systematic attacks on religious minorities such as Yazidis and Christians. In addition, the Kurds, through the People's Protection Units (YPG), have taken advantage of the chaos of the conflict to fight for a degree of autonomy in northern Syria. Syrian territory has been fragmented into several zones controlled by different factions, including groups loyal to Bashar al-Assad, rebel forces, and the Kurds, making the conflict even more difficult to resolve. The war quickly became an international battleground, attracting regional and global powers with strategic interests in Syria. Bashar al-Assad's regime enjoyed decisive support from Russia, which began providing military, logistical, and air support from 2015 onwards. This intervention was a turning point in the conflict, as the Syrian government was struggling to contain the advances of the opposition and jihadist groups. Russian bombing played a key role in the recapture of regions such as Aleppo. Iran, another key ally of Assad, also stepped up its military support, sending Shiite militias and Lebanese Hezbollah fighters. Iran saw Syria as a strategic partner in its policy of regional expansion. Meanwhile, the United States and several European nations supported rebel groups considered moderate, providing arms and financial aid. However, with the rise of ISIS, the focus of Western intervention shifted to fighting jihadist extremism. During the war, there has been recurrent use of chemical weapons, such as in Ghouta, 2013, Khan Shaykhun, 2017, and Douma, 2018. Most international reports blame the Assad regime, despite official denials. These attacks have caused great international outrage, but the response has been limited to one-off military actions and sanctions, without preventing the war from continuing. The humanitarian consequences have been devastating. More than 500,000 dead, 13 million displaced and 6 million refugees. The country's infrastructure was razed to the ground, the economy collapsed and millions now live in extreme poverty. The impact is visible in an entire generation marked by trauma, loss, and a lack of prospects. Bashar al-Assad is currently in power and controls most of Syrian territory, thanks to the support of allies such as Russia and Iran. However, peace remains distant. Regions such as Idlib remain under jihadist control, the northeast is under Kurdish influence, and the south is experiencing pockets of instability. Rebuilding the country will require hundreds of billions of dollars, but faces obstacles such as sanctions, political distrust, and a lack of international consensus. The Syrian war represents not only a national tragedy, but also a collective failure on the part of the international community. A conflict that began with legitimate demands for freedom has degenerated into one of the greatest humanitarian and geopolitical disasters of the 21st century. Syria has become a symbol of the complexity of contemporary conflicts and the urgency of political and human solutions. Rebuilding the country and supporting its people are, more than ever, a global moral responsibility.